All right, today we're going to talk about kind of the military history of World War One. Yesterday we had kind of talked about the buildup and the causes of it. So now we're into the war and what's going on. And I know a lot of you are get really excited about the military history, but in this type of class, kind of a survey class, I'm not going to go in. I did take a whole semester class on the military history of World War One, so that's how much time we could literally spend on it. So I'm just going to give you the brief major highlights of the war, the technology, some of the main battles, and kind of let you fill in the blanks with your own study later as to what exactly did things. There's great movies. We're going to talk about tanks today. There's a great Netflix documentary series on tanks called The Age of Tanks. I was in an armored unit in the Army, and so I kind of like that stuff. But there were also, that movie 1917 that was just out. I enjoyed that immensely as a student of World War One and being a veteran in that whole war experience. So let me just jump right in today then with this military history of World War One. World War One is unique in world wars because it was like no other war ever before preceding it. And in many respects, it was the first truly modern war. Never before had technology been put to such destructive ends. On land, at sea, and in the air, mechanized warfare was carried out with devastating efficiency. And what I mean by mechanized warfare, I'm referring to the use of advanced machines in war. Aircraft, armored vehicles, modern artillery, machine guns. These are all components of mechanized warfare. So let's take a look at the characteristics of World War I and see how new technologies were adapted in a variety of contexts. The Great War, another name for World War I, was fought on land in a much different way than the wars that predated it. Warfare in the 18th and 19th century, what we call Napoleonic warfare, was highly formalized. Cavalry played a critical role, and men lined up in formations to fight in open spaces. I mean, think about the American Civil War, if you have any knowledge of that, and the famous Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. Why was Pickett's charge so devastating? Because what you have is the Union Army on top of this ridge, cemetery ridge, their artillery pointed down. They're behind barriers, walls, rocks, where you can't shoot at them openly. And here comes the Confederate Army, all in nice lines, just marching valiantly across this wide open field, and they're just getting slaughtered by Union artillery and gunfire. So in major battles, Union and Confederate armies would march steadily toward one another, then fire volleys before charging. And you'd think it was just the stupidity of the Confederate army doing this. Well, the Union army did the exact same thing at the Battle of Fredericksburg. It was just how war was fought at this time. Men who took cover behind trees, rocks, or in ditches were singled out as cowards. Flash forward 50 years, World War I was completely different. The open space between the opposing trench systems was commonly referred to as no man's land because no man wanted to enter this dangerous area. Holed up underground for weeks and months at a time, the men lived in trenches experiencing horrible conditions. When it rained, these hand-dug ditches would flood. Rats, infestations of insects, fleas, lice, roaches, all lived in these ditches with the men. The water didn't drain right, and so it would get, I can't think of the right word, water that sits for long is stagnant and, a breeding ground for mosquitoes and disease. So cold weather, rain, mud, food shortages, rats, and disease were just a few of the difficulties they had to bear. And each side would rain down heavy artillery shells across no man's land, hoping to weaken enemy positions. And there was nothing you could do but sit there and listen. And hope that it wasn't aiming for you, that shell didn't have your name on it. And so you can imagine, this is where we get the term shell shock, the mental devastation effect this would have on the ordinary soldier just sitting there hoping there's nothing they could do. There's nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. You were stuck in this ditch hoping that shell wasn't your end. So those who stuck their heads above the trench risked being hit by a sniper's bullet. And the constant noise of artillery barrages that day and night caused some men to suffer mental instability, that shell shock that we talked about. So when one side felt it was in a position to advance, officers ordered their men to climb over the trench and embark on a suicidal charge across no man's land with the hope of climbing into the enemy trench and overrunning it. Now, in between these trenches and no man's land were another one of these World War I technological advances, and that was barbed wire. The trenches, the no man's land, not only is it now crater pocked, so you're not just running straight across, you're running down and up, down and up. They've got barbed wire everywhere to keep you, holed up. It's hard, once you get tangled in it, it's hard to get out of it. And so you're an easy target now. Another major change in World War I land warfare was the improved machine gun, which was capable of bringing death to the hundreds of men charging across no man's land by one person. And although the Gatling machine gun saw limited action during the American Civil War, by the time the Great War broke out, machine guns had undergone dramatic, not to mention deadly, improvements. The most commonly used machine guns of the Great War were the British Vickers machine gun and the German Mechanized Warfare. I know, Leonie, I probably massacred pronouncing that, but the MG is how we always called it. So, artillery also improved between the Civil War and World War I. Larger, more destructive types of cannons were available throughout the Great War. And the two most famous siege guns, or super guns as they were called, were the German Paris gun and Big Bertha. And the roughly 240 millimeter Paris gun, manufactured by Krupp and used to bombard Paris from the remarkable distance of 75 miles, was the largest gun of World War I. And it was so large it had to be transported on a special railroad car. It could fire shells into the stratosphere. I mean, almost leaving Earth completely. And, from 75 miles, there's nothing Parisians could do. They don't even know it's coming. So one of the most important innovations to come out of World War I is the tank. And the world's first combat tank was invented by the British, called the Mark I. And it first saw action in September 1916 in the Battle of the Somme. The tank was originally designed so that no man's land could be safely crossed and enemy positions overrun. The British developed two variants of their tank, male with heavier guns and female with lighter guns. And recognizing the value of this new invention, the Germans developed their own tank, the A7V, which entered service in early 1918. Another scary first of World War I involved the use of poisonous gases. World War I was the first war in which modern chemical warfare was used, and mustard gas and chlorine gas were among the most commonly used poison gases. To protect themselves from gas attacks, a lot of soldiers were issued gas masks. So although submersible vessels were used in the Civil War and even the Revolutionary War, it was not until World War I that submarines saw widespread use. Germany's U-boat fleet was particularly formidable, and U-boat stands for Unterseeboot. I hope I pronounced that right. And it's always nerve-wracking for me to have someone who's German in the class because my German's not that great. So German U-boats were used with deadly efficiency against Allied merchant ships, particularly in the Atlantic, to stop people, particularly the United States, from supplying the Allies with war goods. So in May 1915, U-20 torpedoed the RMS Lusitania, resulting in its sinking and the loss of nearly 1,200 lives, including American lives. And throughout World War I, the British Royal Navy was the most dominant naval force, with the Imperial German Navy following behind. In the years leading up to the outbreak of World War I, both nations, as well as others like Russia and France, modernized their naval forces. And the result was that when war broke out, powerful battleships roamed the sea. Naval blockades became a common tactic as nations attempted to starve one another into submission by preventing imported goods from coming in. The war in the air was also something completely different and new for World War I. It was the first war in which the airplane saw widespread use. Observation balloons and other kinds of airships had been in use for decades, but were primarily designed for reconnaissance. In other words, seeing far ahead what the enemy was up to. Not surprisingly, at the beginning of the war, that's what aircraft was used for also, reconnaissance. But as the war progressed, however, the value of fighter and bomber aircraft became realized. The French in particular helped pioneer military aviation, while the British, German, and others soon caught on, developing their own formidable air corps. And within a short period of time, military aircraft became remarkably sophisticated. Machine guns were mounted on airplanes. And what's even cooler is they timed the loading and firing of the bullets on these machine guns to correspond to how fast the rotor of the airplane was going, so that a bullet always went between the two blades of the rotor, and instead of shooting your own rotor off, which would be kind of bad, I think, in midair. So they synchronized so that they could fire through the plane's propellers. Ingenious, in my opinion. One of the most famous fighter pilots of World War I is a guy with the nickname the Red Baron. He's a German ace renowned for his red plane. It was a Fokker, and his real name was Manfred von Richthofen, the Baron von Richthofen. You heard of him, Leonie?
Nope.
Really? You've never heard of the Red Baron?
I haven't heard his real name.
Oh, okay. So German Zeppelin airships, named after Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, had come into production a few years before the war. And throughout the war, they were used widely for bombing and reconnaissance missions. Because they could appear directly above major cities and drop bombs, Zeppelins had tremendous psychological effects on the people of London and other Allied cities, although their military effectiveness is a matter of debate. So now that we kind of know what the technology that's being used, what the conditions are, let's talk about some of the major battles. The First World War was a brutal conflict resulting in unprecedented destruction and loss of life. So while there were many critical battles throughout the war, some stand out as being more important than others. The battles of Verdun and the Somme are probably the most famous engagements of the war, although there were several other key battles. So as we go along, please remember the difference between an Eastern Front battle and a Western Front battle. Eastern Front battles typically involved combat between Germany and Russia, while Western Front battles were fought on Germany's western border against countries like France, Great Britain, and Belgium. So we're going to take a look at a few famous battles of World War I now, and we'll start with the Battle of Tannenberg. The Battle of Tannenberg was fought between the Russian Second Army and the German Eighth Army from August 26 to August 30th, 1914. And this Eastern Front battle resulted in a decisive defeat for the Russians, who were led by a guy named General Alexander Samsonov. Samsonov's plan was to invade East Prussia with the help of General Paul von Rennkampf's First Army. Initially, things were going well for the Russians. They held a 2-to-1 numeric superiority. But under General Maximilian von Prittwitz, the Germans were retreating, and the German High Command determined this was unacceptable. And they replaced Prittwitz with Generals Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, a couple of people who are going to become very important German leaders after the war. So under their leadership, and this is how they become so popular, they become war heroes. The Germans went on the offensive, they encircled the Russian Eighth Army, and the complete destruction of the Eighth Army handicapped Russia's ability to wage effective war in Prussia for the next year. So significant was this loss that General Alexander Samsonov committed suicide rather than go back to the Tsar and admit his failure. Generals Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg emerged from the battle as national heroes, though. Two important factors led to a decisive German victory at Tannenberg. Firstly, the Germans were able to intercept messages between Russian generals Rennkampf and Samsonov and therefore anticipate their maneuvers. Secondly, the Germans excelled in transporting men and supplies via rail, a skill they had picked up and mastered in the Franco-Prussian War. The Battle of Tannenberg was thus an early indicator of the role rapid troop movements would play. The next battle we'll talk about is the Battle of the Marne, or sometimes called the First Battle of the Marne. It halted the German advance through Belgium and northern France. The German plan was to flank the French by sweeping around their lines in right on the Alsace and Lorraine, around their flank and into their rear, and invade France that way. So the Western Front battle was fought between the French, I've already mentioned, and the British on one side, and the Germans on the other. It was fought between September 5th and 12th, 1914, along the Marne River, which is east of Paris. The battle was immensely important because it prevented a swift German victory. If they had managed to get the flank and get into Paris, the war would have been over, much like the Franco-Prussian War. As soon as they got into Paris, the French were willing to surrender. So huge stop from them. Now, why were the British there? Well, the British were there because Belgium was their ally, and Belgium wanted to remain neutral. But when the Germans figured out they couldn't get through the lines in France because of all the trenches dug, and they tried this sweeping flanking maneuver, the Belgians had no choice but to declare war once they were invaded. And Great Britain said, listen, if Belgium's in war, they're our ally, we're joining the war too. So the Allied victory prevented the Germans from advancing into Paris, and it forced a 4-year entrenched war along the Western Front. Had the Germans not been stopped at the Battle of the Marne, they may well have won the war. One of the most endearing legacies associated with the battle involves the use of taxi cabs to transport troops to the front. The taxis of the Marne, as they've been called, consisted of 600 some Parisian taxicabs that were commandeered for military use. Once they decided they needed reinforcements, they didn't have the rail set up that Germany did. And so they commandeer all these taxi cabs, and the taxi cab drivers, they load troops into these things, and the taxi cabs are delivering the troops to the front. To this day, you can go there, and there are still old taxi cabs that broke down or something that are there. They're kind of covered with vines and everything because they've been in the forest there for now 100 years. But in French memory and history, the taxis of the Marne still hold an almost mythical status of the average Frenchman joining the fight against the Germans. The Battle of Verdun is probably one of the most well-known battles of World War I. This devastatingly brutal Western Front engagement was fought throughout most of 1916 between February 21st to December 18th. And it was fought between the French and Germans in the French city of, you guessed it, Verdun. Verdun was of critical strategic importance to the French. And it was because the Verdun was right on that flank there that we were talking about near Belgium. And the only reason you couldn't flank it was because Verdun had these 3 huge gun forts, I mean, massive guns in these forts. Hosts of major forts protected the city, but these 3 big guns were the most important. Fort Douaumont being the most important. And Verdun also had tremendous symbolic significance among the French. For centuries, the region had been a bulwark against the threat of invasion from Germans. So realizing the value of Verdun, Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of general staff, constructed a plan to bleed the French white by assaulting Verdun. He knew the French would fight ferociously for Verdun to the last man if necessary. And by assaulting Verdun, Falkenhayn believed he could destroy a significant portion of the French army. A few days after the battle began, Fort Douaumont fell, shocking the French. And as time went on, however, the French resistance stiffened under the leadership of General Philippe Pétain. And some of these names are going to become important, like the other 2 German generals I mentioned. Pétain is also going to be important in this post-World War I era leading into World War II. In October, the fort was recaptured by the French. And as the battle dragged on month after month, German casualties became greater than expected. Furthermore, the Battle of the Somme, which began in July, diverted German forces away from Verdun. Finally, in December, the Germans were forced to retreat, enabling a French victory. By most accounts, roughly 700,000 combined casualties resulted from the Battle of Verdun, although some historians believe it could be as high as 1 million people lost in just that single battle. For some perspective, we lost just a little over 1 million people in the entire Vietnam War. So on a side note, General Philippe Pétain emerged from the battle as a national hero. Which brings us to the Battle of the Somme, which was fought between the French and British on one side and the Germans on the other. And this Western Front battle was fought between July to November 1916 along the Somme River in northern France. And like other World War I battles, the Battle of the Somme was a dreadfully bloody engagement with over 1 million casualties. Historians regard it as one of the bloodiest battles in world history ever. The Battle of the Somme was intended to be a decisive breakthrough German lines, and the Germans, however, had better defensive positions than expected, and British and French forces became bogged down amid torrential rainfall. The Battle of the Somme is generally considered a stalemate, and although we should understand it did help relieve pressure on the French by diverting German forces from the Battle of Verdun. The Battle of the Somme, or the Somme Offensive as it has been called, was noteworthy because it was the first battle in which the combat tank was used. The battle has also come to be understood as the quintessential World War I battle because it was characterized by muddy trench warfare and futile loss of life that accomplished nothing for either side. Now, that brings us to the Battle of Ypres. There were actually 3 battles of Ypres. The first Battle of Ypres was fought in October and November 1914. The second Battle of Ypres was fought through April and May 1915. And the third Battle of Ypres, and probably the most well-known, is also called the Battle of Passchendaele. It was fought between July to November 1917. Just so we're clear, Ypres is a city in the Flanders region of western Belgium, not too far from the Atlantic coast. The third Battle of Ypres began as an Allied offensive under the leadership of British General Douglas Haig. And the plan was to break through the German defensive line and sweep north toward the coast. After initial success, Allied armies eventually became bogged down due to heavy rain. And although General Haig claimed victory, the offensive failed to break through German lines and resulted in little change in momentum for the Allies. So like other battles of World War I, it was characterized by futility. Once they realized there was no quick movement, they dug in, and it just became sitting across the trenches looking at each other. It's believed over 500,000 casualties ensued from the Third Battle of Ypres. So a moment ago, I mentioned how Italy switched sides during the war. That was yesterday. Let's talk about this in a little more detail. When war broke out, Italy basically felt it had little to gain from entering the war on the side of the Central Powers, Britain, France. Furthermore, relations between Italy and Austria-Hungary had been strained for years, and recognizing these facts, the Allies secretly tried to coax Italy into joining their side. On April 26, 1915, the Treaty of London was signed, and under this pact, Italy left the Triple Alliance and joined the Triple Entente, the Allies. And within a month, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary. In return for Italian cooperation, the Allies promised to grant Italy territorial concessions following the war, giving them parts of Austria-Hungary connected to Italy. But when the war ended, the Allies failed to follow through with their promises to Italy, and this is one of the reasons why Italy tends to join Germany during World War II. So this caused Italy to feel betrayed and incidentally helped lead to the rise of Mussolini and Italian fascism in the 1920s. And that's where I'll end today, just a short military history, a little understanding of why Italy flipped sides. And we'll get more into the politics and diplomacy that's going on during the war and after the war when we meet back tomorrow. So do you guys have any questions for today?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I'd say have a nice day, but it looks like it's going to rain all day. So cuddle up under a blanket, watch some TV today.
Okay.
All right. We'll see you tomorrow.
All right. Bye.